The day I got the call that my husband had been rushed to the hospital, I was standing in the break room at work, heating up leftover pasta and thinking about nothing more serious than whether I'd remembered to pay the electric bill. That was the last ordinary moment I remember. His name was Cole. We'd been married 6 years. I was 31 years old, and I thought I knew exactly what my life looked like. I thought I understood the people in it. I didn't. Cole was a contractor, residential renovations, mostly kitchen and bathroom remodels, for homeowners in our suburb outside of Columbus. He wasn't flashy about money. We had a decent house, 2 car payments, a dog named Biscuit who shed on everything. Normal, comfortable. The kind of life where you stop paying close attention because nothing seems to require it. The call came from his business partner, a man named Greg, who I had always found a little too slick for my taste. He told me Cole had collapsed at a job site, possible heart attack. They'd taken him by ambulance to Riverside. I drove there with pasta still warm on the counter, and the stove off, because I had the presence of mind for that much at least. Cole survived. It wasn't a heart attack. It was a cardiac arrhythmia, serious but manageable, and a procedure to correct the irregular rhythm. The cardiologist said he'd need 6 to 8 weeks of limited activity. No heavy lifting, no stress. He'd make a full recovery. I exhaled for the first time in 3 hours. I held his hand. I told him we'd figure it out. What I didn't know yet was that there was a lot more to figure out than either of us was prepared for. The first sign that something was wrong came 4 days after Cole got home from the hospital. I was going through the McGill. Something I rarely did because Cole always handled the bills. And I found a past due notice from our mortgage company. 60 days past due, which meant 2 missed payments. I stood there in the kitchen for a long time holding that envelope. When I brought it to Cole, he got this look on his face. Not surprise, not confusion. That look where someone has been waiting for something to arrive, and now it has. He said we'd gotten behind. He said business had been slow. He said he hadn't wanted to worry me. I didn't push him that night. He was still weak, still recovering, and I told myself there was time to sort through the details once he was stronger. I picked up extra shifts at the dental practice where I worked as an office manager. I called the mortgage company and made arrangements. I told myself this was a rough patch and we'd get through it together. But I kept going back to that look on his face. Over the next 2 weeks, I started paying attention to things I'd tuned out for years. The credit card statements, the business account which Cole had always kept separate from our joint account, a stack of opened envelopes in his desk drawer that I'd assumed were just work documents. They weren't work documents, they were collection notices, personal loans I didn't know about, a credit card in his name alone with a balance that made me sit down on the floor of our home office and just stare at the wall for a while. $63,000 in debt. Not counting the mortgage. I did not confront him that night either. I needed to understand what I was looking at before I opened that conversation, so I called my mother. My mother lives 40 minutes away, in the same house where I grew up, in a quiet neighborhood where she's lived since before I was born. She's 62 years old, and she has the kind of calm that comes from having survived enough hard things that ordinary problems don't rattle her anymore. My father left when I was 9. She raised my younger brother and me on a teacher's salary and somehow made it feel like we never missed anything important. I told her what I'd found. All of it. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Sweetheart, you need to understand the whole picture before you decide anything. Don't react to the piece, understand, the whole." It was good advice, but what she said next was the part I didn't expect. She said, "I want you to know something. Whatever happens with Cole, whatever you decide, you and the kids will always have a place here. You hear me? Always." I didn't have kids yet, but I was 12 weeks pregnant and only my mother and one close friend knew. Cole didn't know. I'd been waiting for what felt like the right moment, which had not arrived before the cardiac episode and had certainly not arrived since. I sat in the parking lot of a CVS and cried for 20 minutes. Not because things were bad. Because she'd said that, and I hadn't realized until she said it how much I needed to hear it. I found out the truth about the debt 3 days later, not from Cole but from Greg. Greg called me on a Tuesday morning. Cole was at a follow-up cardiology appointment, and I was home. And Greg's number came up on my phone and something made me answer it even though we had never spoken directly about anything more than holiday party logistics. He sounded nervous. He said he didn't feel right not telling me. He said the business had been struggling for over a year, and that Cole had been borrowing against the company's line of credit to cover operating costs, and that about 8 months ago they'd lost a major contract, a development project that was supposed to carry them through the year. and Cole had been pulling from personal loans and credit to keep things afloat without telling me. I asked him why he was telling me now. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Because he's going to ask you to sign something. A refinancing agreement on the business. And if you sign it without knowing everything, you're going to be taking on a liability you don't understand." I thanked him. I hung up. I sat on my back porch and looked at Biscuit sniffing around the yard and thought about what $63,000 meant for someone who was 12 weeks pregnant. That night, Cole told me he needed to talk to me about the business he'd prepared. There were papers on the kitchen table, organized into a folder with a sticky note that said "Please read." He was calm in the way people are when they've rehearsed. He explained the debt. He explained the plan. He said Greg had found a private lender willing to refinance the business debt at a lower rate, and that it would require both of our signatures because we'd need to use the house as collateral. He slid the papers across the table to me. I looked at him. I said, "Cole, I know about the $63,000. Greg called me." The calm dissolved instantly. His face shifted through 3 or 4 emotions in about 2 seconds. Shock, then anger at Greg, then something else. Something that looked almost like relief, like he'd been holding his breath for so long that even being caught felt better than continuing. We talked for 4 hours that night. It wasn't one of those movie arguments where people say perfect things and come to clean conclusions. It was messy and painful and went in circles. He cried. I cried. At one point we both just sat there in silence for a long time. I told him I was pregnant. He broke down completely. He said he was sorry. He said he hadn't known how to tell me about the money and that the longer he waited the more impossible it felt. He said he'd been so ashamed he couldn't think straight. I believed him. I also knew that belief and trust were 2 different things, and that what we had in front of us was a problem I couldn't solve in one night. I did not sign the papers. I called my mother the next morning and told her everything. She listened the way she always has. Completely, without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Come over this weekend, bring whatever you need. Let's sit down and figure out what's real." I said, "Mom, we might lose the house." She said, "I know, come anyway." My brother was there when I arrived Saturday morning. He's 3 years younger than me, works in IT, and has always been the kind of person who shows up without being asked, and then acts like it's nothing. He had coffee made and a notebook on the table because my brother processes everything by writing it down, and he'd apparently decided we were going to treat this like a project. I sat down at that kitchen table, the same one where I'd done homework for 12 years, and for the first time since the mortgage envelope, I didn't feel like I was drowning. We went through everything I'd brought, the statements, the collection notices, the refinancing proposal which my brother read 3 times and then sat down and said, "Don't sign this. This lender's terms are predatory. If the business doesn't turn around within 18 months, you lose the house, and they can come after personal assets beyond that." My mother, who had been quiet through most of this, looked at the papers and then looked at me and said, "Do you want to save the marriage, or do you want to save yourself first? Because those might require different plans." It was the most direct thing she'd ever said to me. And it was exactly the right question. I want to tell you about the moment things cracked open. Really cracked open. It was a Sunday afternoon, about 2 weeks after the conversation at my mother's kitchen table. Cole and I had been in an uneasy kind of détente, coexisting, being careful with each other, not quite trusting and not quite giving up. I'd hired an attorney just to understand what my options were. I hadn't told Cole about that. I was upstairs in the bedroom, on a video call with a college friend who lives in Seattle now, and I'd stepped out onto the small balcony for better reception. From there I could hear faintly Cole on the phone downstairs in the backyard. "Our yard isn't big, sound carries?" I wasn't trying to listen, but I caught Greg's name, and then I caught mine. I ended my call quietly and stood very still. Cole was saying that he'd hoped I'd sign the papers without asking too many questions. That he'd known I wouldn't understand the full picture of the business. That if Greg hadn't called me, he probably could have gotten me to sign before I looked too closely. He wasn't angry. He wasn't yelling. He was saying it the way you say something you believe is simply true. My hand was on the railing and I remember thinking very clearly, I don't know this person, not in a dramatic way, in a cold, factual way, like I'd just identified an error in a spreadsheet. I went downstairs when he came back inside. He was surprised to see me in the kitchen. "I'd been upstairs," I said. "I heard your call." He went pale. I said, "How long have you been managing me?" He didn't answer right away. And in that silence, I understood that this wasn't just about debt or business problems or bad luck. This was about the fact that my husband had looked at me and decided, somewhere along the way, that the version of reality he showed me was a product he curated, and that I was the audience, not the partner. I walked out of the kitchen, I went to our bedroom, locked the door, and called my mother. She picked up on the second ring. I said, "I think I need to come home for a while." She said, "I'll have the guest room ready by tonight." Leaving is not the clean, decisive act that people imagine from the outside. I didn't leave that night. I left 4 days later, after I'd spoken to my attorney twice more. After I'd quietly transferred my direct deposit to a personal account I opened at a different bank. After I'd had a long conversation with my OB about stress management during the first trimester. I left on a Wednesday morning when Cole was meeting with Greg about the business, and I packed what I needed into 2 bags and the back of my car, and I drove to my mother's house with Biscuit in the passenger seat, looking at me like he understood more than he was letting on. My mother was waiting on the porch when I pulled up. She didn't say anything, she just came down the steps and hugged me in the driveway for a long time. My brother showed up an hour later with a casserole and that notebook again, because he is who he is. And I sat in my mother's kitchen and ate something real for the first time in weeks, and started to feel, slowly, like I could think. The next several weeks were not simple. Cole called. He came to the house. There were conversations that went nowhere, and conversations that almost went somewhere, and conversations that left me exhausted in ways I hadn't known exhaustion could feel. He wasn't a monster. That's the complicated part. He was a person who had made a series of choices based on fear and pride, and a fundamental unwillingness to let me see him struggling, and those choices had compounded into something that broke the foundation of what we'd built. I understand fear. I understand shame. What I couldn't forgive, and what became clearer to me the longer I was away from it, was the calculation, the decision to manage my perception rather than trust me with the truth. That's not a mistake you make once. That's a pattern. My attorney helped me understand the financial picture. Because I hadn't signed the refinancing papers and because the debt was primarily in Cole's name or through the business entity, my personal exposure was more limited than I'd feared. The house was complicated. It was in both our names and had equity, though less than I'd thought. We'd eventually negotiate a buyout. The process was painful and slow, and there were days I sat in my mother's guest room and stared at the ceiling and did the math in my head so many times that the numbers stopped meaning anything. But I was not, as I'd feared in my worst moments, going to end up financially ruined. Shaken, starting over. But not ruined. I was 16 weeks pregnant when I finally told Cole about the baby in a context that wasn't the middle of a crisis. We met at a coffee shop near the old neighborhood, neutral ground. I'd asked him to come alone and he did. He looked tired in the way people look when they've stopped performing, I told him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What do you need from me? Not what does this mean for us? Not does this change things? Just, what do you need?" It was, I realized, the most honest thing he'd said to me in longer than I could place. I told him what I needed: a clean financial separation, support during the pregnancy, involvement in the child's life as a co-parent if he was willing to do the work to earn that, and full transparency, not curated truth. Not managed information, just actual honesty, even when it was uncomfortable, or there was nothing to build on. He said he'd try. I told him trying wasn't enough. That trying meant a therapist. It meant documented agreements. It meant rebuilding trust through action over time, not promises. He nodded. He said okay. I drove back to my mother's house and sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going in. The trees on her street were starting to turn. It was late September by then, the kind of afternoon where the light comes in low and gold, and everything looks a little more bearable than it did an hour ago. I thought about what my mother had said those first weeks. You don't have to know everything yet. You just have to know the next right step. I didn't know everything. I still don't. But I knew the next step. I knew I was going to have this baby in a house where I felt safe, surrounded by people who had showed up when things fell apart. And I knew that whatever came after that, I was going to face it with a clearer picture than the one I'd been living inside for years. There's a thing people say about family, that they'll always be there. And sometimes it's true in the way it's meant, and sometimes it's just something people say. My mother was there. My brother was there. They didn't ask me to explain myself or justify my choices. They didn't tell me what to do. They made space and they showed up and they let me figure out what I already knew. Cole's parents are another story, and it's one I'm still in the middle of. His mother, who I'd considered close for years, took his side in ways that felt personal even when she claimed they weren't. His father went quiet, which is its own kind of answer. There was a conversation with his mother on the phone, about 3 weeks in, where she said some things that I won't repeat here because I've worked too hard to let them go. What I will say is that I hung up the phone, walked into my mother's kitchen, and my mother looked at my face and said, "Sit down, I'll make tea." And she did, and it helped. Not because tea fixes anything, but because the person making it was someone who, when it mattered, had chosen me. My daughter was born in March. I named her June, which confused some people given the timing, but my grandmother's name was June, and I'd been thinking about her a lot in those months. A woman who had faced harder things than I ever will, and faced them with a kind of steadiness I've always wanted to inherit. My mother was in the delivery room. My brother paced the waiting room floor for 4 hours, and then cried when he saw her, which he will deny if you ask him. Cole was there too. We'd settled into something that I wouldn't call friendship but wouldn't call war either. He's in therapy. He's working a smaller operation now, more carefully. He sends support reliably, and shows up when he says he will. Which is more than I could have predicted a year ago, and which I'm choosing to take as information about who he might be becoming, rather than evidence of who he always was. I don't know what we'll look like in 5 years. I don't know if there's a version of this where we find our way back to something, or if that's even what I want. Some questions don't have answers yet, and that used to terrify me, and now it just is. What I know is this. The people who showed up when I needed them most didn't need to be asked twice. They just came. And in the middle of the worst year of my life, I found out what my family actually was, underneath the assumptions and the history and the ordinary noise of people who've known each other long enough to stop paying attention. It was smaller than I thought, in terms of numbers, but it was solid all the way through. If you're watching this and you're in something right now, something that feels like too many pieces to hold at once, I want you to hear what I wish someone had said to me in that CVS parking lot when I was crying into the steering wheel. You don't have to figure it all out tonight. You just have to know who picks up the phone. Because the people who pick up, those are your people. That's your family, whatever shape it comes in. June is 8 months old now. She has her dad's nose and my mother's eyes, and I suspect she gets from me. She doesn't know any of this story yet. Someday I'll tell her some version of it. The version that's true, and also the version that's age appropriate, which are not always the same thing. But I'll tell her that the year she was born, I learned something I couldn't have learned any other way. That the life I thought I was living, and the life I was actually living, were two different things, and that finding out the difference, as painful as it was the thing that set me free. I'll tell her that her grandmother was waiting on the porch when I pulled up. I'll tell her that was enough.